you. And you sing me and on it will we stay true.
Hello? Oh. Hi, everyone. I'm a little nervous. Not a great public speaker like my mother was. I just wanted to begin by thank you all for coming. I wanted to give a special thank you to those who helped me put this together. I honestly could have not done this by myself, and the support that I've gotten has been, I'm just extremely grateful for everyone. I would also like to thank Judson Church for letting us have this event here. This all still seems pretty unreal to me. My mother, Drucilla Cornell, was, in one word, amazing. She was overfilled with love, and she used it in the best way to help others. It didn't matter if you were a close friend or a person on the street. She would always make you feel like you're the most important person in the world. Love is the best gift that you can give anyone, and my mother made sure that everyone felt that. Drucilla Cornell was not only my mother, she was also a professor who went above and beyond for her students. She was a lawyer, an author, reaching people all over the world with her ideas, and an activist always fighting for what was right. I'm sure you guys all know this, but my mother saved my life. She adopted me when I was a baby from Paraguay. I was an extremely sick child, but she never gave up on me, and she's the reason that I'm here today. She was my best friend in the world. You all know how close we were. We did everything together. We did movies, dinners, even doctor's appointments. The world has really lost someone irreplaceable, but we do gain memories, lessons, and laughter that will remain for a lifetime. I just want to say to her, if she were here, that I love you, and I love you every second, and I will always love you forever. I really want to thank you all for being here. I know each and every one of you individually in different ways. Some of you have traveled very far to be here, and I deeply appreciate every single one of you. It means a lot to me. I'm gonna play a short video of my mom, and after her sister, Jill Gawaltney, will be the next one to speak. Thank you all.
About to be 29, and this song is dedicated to her and to her best friend. There now, here's the last that I can say. While I give to you and you give to me true love. And on it will all we speak true for you and I have the God with nothing to do. Back to get to you and to me. It's all forever true. Woo! Love you, Mom! What's your name?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. And Sarita, that was wonderful. You did a beautiful job. So what was it like being Drucilla's little sister? She was larger than life, a unique character, a writer, a philosopher, a thinker, and always up for a good protest, which interestingly enough landed our mother in the principal's office a number of times. I think the first time was second grade when she refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance because she said it was fascist. Yeah, typical 7-year-old, I think. And then in the 8th grade, she amassed 137 tardies because she refused to go to class when the bell rang because they were treating her like Pavlov's dog. But she always looked after the less fortunate or the peoples that she thought were being treated unjustly. And it also, in the 8th grade, there was a teacher who was mean to a couple of the boys in the class. So she organized a protest where at a certain time, everyone was going to march out of the class. So the time happened, and Drew marched out. Unfortunately, nobody followed her. So my mother ended up, yes, back in the principal's office. One of the things that Drew did that was just amazing, she was a voracious reader. So as a teenager, she'd be reading Sartre, Camus, Nietzsche, Hegel, all of these authors. And then when she went to Scripps, which was the first college she went to about 6 different colleges because none of them were quite right. And she took German so she could read Hegel in German, which was just incredible. And I never had to go on any college tours because I just visited her wherever she went. Scripps, Santa Barbara, Berkeley, then she went overseas. She finally ended up at Stanford and then got her degree and went on to UCLA Law School. And at UCLA, she was awarded the award of the Quaff, I believe, for the top 10% of students. She was a fantastic student. And of course, she also was organizing. She organized the electrical workers. She organized in Silicon Valley workers in the semiconductor factory, always looking after people that were less fortunate or that she thought were being treated unfairly. She even represented porn stars who were not getting proper rights during the filming of their movies, shall we call them? So it was just the way she looked after everybody, and I think that's what I admired the most about Drucilla, is not only her love and dedication to Sarita, but that everyone had the right to equality, and in the imaginary domain, the right for justice and to be themselves. So thank you, Drew. I miss you already. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I was asked to put together a few PowerPoint photos relevant to today's event, so we'll be trying to show them here. In September 1970, I first met the extraordinary person that we're honoring today. What happened was I'd returned to college from my semester abroad, and I went to see a former roommate whose name happened to be Brad Cornell. But when I walked into Brad's dorm room, the first thing I saw was 2 small feet wiggling underneath a bed frame, and somebody pleading, "Rosa, Rosa, come here, Rosa." And then what happened was that emerging from under the bed frame was a beaming young woman who was holding her tiny black cat, who was named Rosa Luxemburg, of course. Now, Drucilla and I soon became inseparable activists in the anti-war and labor movements that were swirling around the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically Palo Alto in that period. Though Drew was raised, of course, in an affluent Republican small town, of course, by college, so much had gone on in those years that she called herself a committed Marxist feminist activist and aimed to put her social justice concerns into action as best she could. She later wrote, and I'll quote here, My activism, like so many others of my generation, grew out of the gross contradictions between what the United States supposedly stood for as the leader of the free world and the brutal realities of systematic racism, sexism, classism, and neo-colonialism abroad. I was born in 1950, the dawn of a promised American century in the Southern California homeland of the John Birch Society, a militant anti-communist organization. So in that first meeting, when I met Drucilla, could you click the slide? This was our political mascot who was under the bed, Rosa Luxemburg, who was followed by the much beloved Molly. But then, if you would click to the next slide, then, the anti-war movement, of course, was just totally dominant at Stanford in those years. Thousands of people routinely coming out, voting, occupying buildings. Tenured professors, one in particular, got fired or reprimanded for their activity. So Stanford was not shy about dealing with protesters. And into this, Drew became a very, very committed activist. After all, it's important to remember, I think, that by 1970, already over 54,900 American soldiers have been killed in Vietnam, and between 2.5 and 3.5 million Vietnamese and Laotians and Cambodians. So we were very much concerned with the fact that Stanford, as we learned, was up to its neck in electronic warfare research, and that's what led to a lot of people getting very active about that. But as the anti-war movement splintered into factions, next slide if you would. As the anti-war movement split into factions, Drew and I began to move more and more towards the group that was getting into labor organizing. Some people were like the weatherman, going that route, right? We didn't want to go that route. So we and others began to look into, trying to work with people in a variety of different kinds of jobs. And we also moved to New York City. So an important thing about Drucilla Cornell is that she, though raised in Southern California, was a committed New York City, specifically Manhattan resident, raised Sarita here. Sarita, of course, has spent her entire life in Manhattan. But Drew initially was not in academia. I was in grad school. She became an activist organizing clerical workers at Columbia. She got fired. Columbia was very brutal with labor organizing. But 10 years later, finally, after the efforts of her and others, the Columbia clerical workers got a union that they have today. But then after being fired, she actually went across the river to northern New Jersey, where she literally worked in electronics factories in Hackensack, working with the UAW union, trying to get people organized there. She fought with union leaders as well as with management. And that was her life as a very active labor organizer, which I've discovered a lot of her academic colleagues who revere her for her enormous academic contributions are not very aware of. But I would make the argument, and I know I don't have much time, but I would make the argument that a lot of her academic concerns, especially about ethics and social justice, really deeply reflected what she was doing earlier in the anti-war and in the labor movements. If you could click the slide. So this is her speaking at Columbia, in the center of Columbia's campus at the Sundial, trying to organize. She was on the front page of the student newspaper, trying to organize clerical workers. If you can see that slim figure in the very center of the photo. The next slide, please. If you're interested in this, a few years ago I asked her, I said, have you ever published your life in labor? And she said, no, actually, I've never talked about it. So she did finally put together an article, and if you want to know the details, since we don't have time here, have a look at the link. It's in her obituary in the journal Regional Labor Review, where she goes on at length about both the anti-war activity and also about her activity with labor unions. If you'd click. As you all know, of course, Drucilla, and one reason we're honoring her is her enormous productivity, both as an educator, but also as a writer, and her books will live on long after today, and an eternal legacy, really, to her work. Others will talk about that in a moment. Next. But in many ways, I think it's fair to say that her proudest achievement of all was as a mother. And she really adored Sarita. And these last few years of her, she was just wondering with delight at Sarita's growing up and becoming a young woman. She went through thick and thin with Sarita. This was the crisis day when Sarita got her ears pierced for the first time. She's smiling now, but believe me, the other photos I have, not so much. But she was a brave girl. So next. But one thing about Drucilla is she always loved giving parties, had a lot of friends. So she was giving parties when Sarita first came to the U.S. Here's one in 1997. You can see her great friend, Emma Bianchi, on the right. And one thing about Emma, apparently, is that she always sits on the right-hand side of tables. That's Emma down there on the right hand, close to the door. Emma is going to talk in a moment. She can explain herself. But Drucilla also was already planning her Christmas party when, sadly, she went into the hospital for the last time. So very convivial, loved people, and of course loved to always have Sarita there. For the next. Yeah, so I'll leave you with this slide. I love this slide. It really sums up a lot about what a wonderful person Drucilla was, and obviously we're all going to miss her terribly, but always remember her fondly. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for coming today. I'm Ann Huck. Drucilla was one of my oldest friends. We met around age 4. In those days, I was always called Annie to distinguish me from Ann Foster, and Drucilla was called Drew. We were fast friends all through elementary school in the 1950s, and in fact had our desks pushed together in Mrs. Larson's 3rd grade class. As she sometimes said, I was her first student. In 3rd grade, she taught me a new subtraction technique that her smart older brother Brad had taught her. I remember getting all of the math problems wrong using Brad's technique, while she got them all right. Clearly, I didn't always understand everything Drucilla tried to teach me, but from a young age, she was generous in sharing her knowledge and insights. Drucilla and I weren't really friends during junior high and high school. She was one of the popular girls, and I decidedly was not. By coincidence, we both ended up at Scripps College in Claremont, California, for our freshman year. Neither of us was happy at Scripps and never spent a weekend there. Drew called her grandmother Nana to come pick us up the first weekend, and that established the pattern. Scripps had a mandatory old-fashioned 4-year humanities program. We were expected to read the Bible, Plato, Aristotle, Euripides, Aristophanes, Thucydides, and on in their entirety. I was sinking fast, but at some point realized that Drucilla was reading and understanding every word, even though we seemed to spend most of our time walking to the hub to buy buttermilk donuts. She helped me study for final exams. One of her instructions for writing essays was to always throw in a quote from Nietzsche. She taught me a few quotes that were applicable whatever the topic. I passed. Drew transferred to Berkeley for 1 quarter, during which she was tear-gassed in Sproul Plaza, and then at UCSB watched the local Bank of America burn. She didn't much like those experiences either. In the fall of 1969, we went to Europe, spending 3 weeks in England, 3 weeks in Germany, and 3 weeks in Austria. I did a lot of sightseeing, and she did a lot of reading. Our pattern was to settle in a place, choose one restaurant, not necessarily a good one, one dish, and then happily settle down to that routine. Drew ate the meat, and I ate the vegetables, and we both ate a lot of bread. As both Sarita and Greg could tell you, a lot of funny stories came out of that trip to Europe. Drew and I thought those stories were hilarious, but I'm not sure that anyone else did. Nevertheless, I will tell you one funny story to give you a flavor of the trip. We were going by train from London to Windsor. Drew said we should give our bags to a porter. We did, and then promptly lost the porter. We got on the train and hoped for the best. I was a bit apprehensive, but she'd been to Europe before, and I hadn't. At some point, at the Virginia Water station, we realized from what other passengers were saying that we were not on the way to Windsor. Unbeknownst to us, the train had split into two parts. We jumped off the train and then remembered our suitcases. I was panicking, and after a brief attempt to run after the departing train, turned to Drew and asked what we were supposed to do now. She calmly replied that we would call Nana. This was before cell phones, in the days when one made an appointment at the post office days in advance to make an international call. To me, that didn't seem like much of a solution. As so often happened on that trip, everything worked out fine in the end. We didn't call Nana, and the porter had put our baggage on the part of the train going to Windsor. We were the ones who were lost. The station attendant in Windsor could barely suppress his giggles when he saw us, two frazzled young Americans in wool coats that reached to the ground. In 1970, both Drew and I ended up at Stanford. For 1 quarter, we shared a dorm room. Living with Drew could be a challenge. I still contend that expecting someone to return a borrowed tube of toothpaste rather than leaving it in the communal dorm bathroom was not a sign of being a hopelessly bourgeois capitalist. Drucilla wasn't always right about everything. She had a car at Stanford. One time she told me that she had gotten the best Christmas present from her parents, a gas credit card. With that card, she claimed that you never had to pay for gas again. You just showed them a card and that was that. I tried to say that I didn't think it quite worked that way, but as I remember it, she was quite insistent. Our friendship continued over the years as Drucilla met Greg, became more active politically, developed her thoughts in books and lectures, and influenced her many students. Some things remained the same. Her eating habits, one could have wished those had changed, her laughter and ability to see the absurdity of life, and her tremendous generosity. Like Nana, she was loyal to her family and friends and supportive of others beyond that circle whenever she could be. Above all, she loved Sarita. Drucilla appreciated that Sarita had different skills and talents than she herself had. She worked hard to allow Sarita to develop those talents while also developing in her Nana's generosity and the Cornell efficiency. It makes me happy to see Drucilla's spirit reflected in Sarita.
Thanks, Annie. And hi, Sarita. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm really happy and honored to be here to finally get to see a lot of you. It's been 6 months, and I know a lot of us know we needed this day to think and talk and reflect and remember Drucilla. I met Drucilla twice, like many of us. The first through her writings. I read The Philosophy of the Limit my first year in graduate school at Berkeley. And the book really did, it's one of those, it's a trite thing, but it changed my life. Drucilla in that book makes a number of very complicated arguments, but it boils down to something very simple, which is that philosophy can't tell you how the world should be. It's a very Hegelian idea, or how to make it the way you want. But philosophy guards what she calls the limit, the ever-present possibility of revolutionary change. Philosophy holds open the possibility that the world can be ethical, different, transformed. That book really did encapsulate what I was thinking or trying to think. And, I saw Drucilla as, at that time, a revolutionary in the truest sense of the word. She wanted to turn the world back, to revolve it back to its foundational ideals, the ideals that make the world magical and yet are never actualized. She always wrote against abstraction, and she thought through struggle and towards concrete transformation. So then I met Drucilla a second time. I was at my alma mater, Amherst College, while I was in my second year of graduate school. And I was there for a conference, and I saw that Drucilla's name was on the program, and I got very excited. So I went up to one of my professors at the time, Judith Butler, and said, I've always wanted to meet Drucilla Cornell. I really loved her writing. Do you know her? Not knowing they were friends. And she stood up in the middle of this big conference and said, "Hey, Drucilla!" And I was embarrassed and terrified. And Drucilla came over, waltzing over in a green flowing outfit with many, many layers of chiffon and silk, all of her rings. And to my 22-year-old, at that point, still pretty preppy suburban self, she seemed like someone from another planet. She informed me that she dressed this way when speaking about sexual harassment to be the image of Justice Scalia's fantasy of the woman who wanted to be raped. Something she spoke about in public many times, I heard after that. I told her that I loved her work and wanted to drop out of grad school and come study with her. And to my shock, 6 months later, I was in New York City. Drucilla had just recently adopted Sarita from Paraguay. It was her proudest achievement. We would meet in Drucilla's apartment, at that point, way over on the west side on Washington Street. We would read Hegel and Lacan while taking turns feeding and burping Sarita. One thing that Drucilla taught me about parenting was to have timeouts for moral reflection, something that I always thought was the most amazing and senseless but also wonderful way of raising a child. And that began for me and for her, I think, one of the most magnificent and unique friendships that I could ever have imagined. I went back to Berkeley, finished my graduate school, spent some time living in Germany. But I always came back to New York, that's where I was from, and over the next 30 years, Drucilla and I formed countless reading groups. We had reading groups in her house. We had reading groups on psychoanalysis and law that used to meet at my first apartment in New York on Mercer Street. When she was living in Cape Town, I twice went over and visited her for extended stays there. And we had reading groups on Immanuel Kant with the Constitutional Court judge, Laurie Ackerman. The reading group that we had that Drucilla liked to talk about most was our close reading of Kant's First Critique that took place with just the two of us, really reading it 10 pages at a time over months in the year 2005. I know the date pretty well for a simple reason. It was in the midst of one of our reading sessions, as we were deeply engaged in parsing Kant's transcendental deduction, that I got a phone call from my wife, Jenny Lynn Bader. She was starting to have early signs of labor. I asked if I should come home immediately, and she said, soon, but nothing imminent. I put down the phone and said to Drucilla, okay, let's just get through this page. She looked at me and said, go home. Wise woman. Drucilla loved to tell that story, and she specifically loved to tell that story to my first child, Madeline. She loved my family. She loved Jenny Lynn, who is a playwright, and Drucilla, as many of you know, took up playwriting and wrote 2 wonderful plays. and loved to show them to Jenny Lynn and talk to her about them. She loved my son Alfred, who was a big chess player, and Drucilla loved to talk to Alfred about chess. She seemed to have, she had all sorts of interests and seemingly infinite number of knowledge. I'm sorry. Drucilla and I shared a legal background and interest, and one surprising area of agreement and fascination that we discovered was our interest in revenge. We both had incredible fantasies of revenge. We opposed the death penalty, yet we both thought people should be killed mercilessly. At the time, I was writing a book on revenge that I never finished. But Drucilla was deeply immersed in the highbrow cinematic oeuvre of Clint Eastwood. And that was the background for lengthy discussions about the movie Mystic River, and the only one of the many essays we always talked about writing, but never did. But that one, finally, we did, and published it. Drucilla was a revolutionary and a radical, me less so. We shared a profound desire for revolutionary transformation. We shared a deep belief in equality and freedom, that the law must strive to be the institutional embodiment of justice, even if it must always fail. She loved a term that we would sort of talk about together called radical conservative, someone radically committed to bringing about a conservation of the true ideals of the world. The day in the West Village bar when she announced to me that she'd finally decided that she saw herself as a radical conservative was one we shared with real joy and a little bit of wine and champagne. Drucilla believed in the power of ideas. She was also suspicious of the language of power that dominated much of academic theory at that time. She believed that the ideas of justice and equality and freedom were not just ideas, that they had power and meaning in themselves to change the world. And that was the origin of a book series we created called Just Ideas, which originally was embraced by Helen Tartar, a wonderful editor at Fordham University Press, who unfortunately died too early in a car crash, and then taken over by Tom Lay. And that's a project that she and I have now worked on for almost 20 years together, publishing books that express this idea of the power of ideas to change the world. Drucilla was fearless, independent, and always hopeful. She did not hesitate when I asked her to have a public conversation with Charles Murray. She always used to tell me how much fun she had at that conversation. Nor did Drucilla hesitate when I asked her to sign a letter I played a part in writing that appeared in Harper's Magazine, extolling greater efforts at racial and gender inclusion, but also calling for greater efforts to maintain open debate and toleration of political differences. She even took to the internet after the letter was published and became one of the most vocal defenders of the letter. The point is, she was totally unique. I can't imagine us finding someone like her again. She was unbelievably loyal to her friends. She collected friends from all walks of life, from her trainer to her Dr. Matarese, to Arena, who became part of her family. She was at home in a world of unbelievable plurality and excitement and difference. These were the people who loved Drucilla and who she loved. They were her friends and really her family. To be friends with Drucilla was to listen to her stories, often 10 or 15 times in a day. She loved to tell stories. She loved to embellish stories. And yet some of them are, what's amazing about them is some of them are just true. You think they're embellished, but they really were true. And sometimes you couldn't tell the difference, and I'm not sure I still know. She told stories with gusto and laughter. She was larger than life. She said about her grandmother, Mildred Kello, in a wonderful book on her grandmother and her daughter, Sarita, that Mildred Kello was one of the miracles of her life. When I think back at times I've spent together with Drucilla and Sarita in Cape Town and Barbados, here in New York, up at Bard, walking through the West Village, seeing how she knew everyone, eating the worst food you could ever imagine at the worst restaurants in the West Village. And just remembering how much fun we had, I realized that she was really the miracle, one of the miracles of my life, and I miss her greatly. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shayla Ben Habib. You've heard about Drucilla and friendship. And I met Drucilla nearly 40 years ago during one of the summer sessions of the Philosophy and Social Sciences course in Dubrovnik, Croatia. The Dubrovnik seminars were seminal for my generation. They had brought together luminaries such as Charles Taylor, Jürgen Habermas, Albrecht Wellmer, Dick Bernstein, with colleagues of the Yugoslav Praxis group who were dissidents, who were trying to militate for a more humanistic socialism on the basis of a return to the writings of the young Marx. The distinguished gentleman had heard that the women were up to something called feminism, and that there was something called feminist theory afoot. And we were invited by the old Communist Party members of the Yugoslav group to edit a special issue of the journal Praxis International. The volume that Drucilla and I then published, called Feminism as Critique, Essays on the Politics of Gender in Late Capitalist Societies in 1987, was the beginning of a nearly 40-year-old friendship. These were years of great theoretical effervescence, and Drucilla was a leading voice. She brought, as you have heard, European high theory, Lacan, Derrida, Hegel, to the raging feminist debates about pornography and abortion. Hers was a unique voice raised against the sexual puritanism of some in the women's movement. She defined the task of ethical feminism as the possibility, quote, of symbolizing the significance of the feminine in all its complexity, as it is both represented and played out in the lives of men and women, something that she called, as Jill mentioned, the imaginary domain that we live and act out our sexuality on. In 2001, Drucilla visited South Africa for the first time. She was then invited to the University of Cape Town in 2007, where she was named the National Research Foundation Chair in Customary Law, Indigenous Values, and the Dignity Jurisprudence, out of which came two incredible books on the indigenous jurisprudence of South Africa called Ubuntu. Nothing like this exists in comparative legal theory, and I think that both maybe Jane and Louis will talk about the significance of this work. But let me shift gears for a second. We were not just intellectual colleagues and comrades, we were girlfriends. We talked about our clothes, we talked about our hair, but above all, we talked about our daughters. We talked about husbands or ex-husbands. But with our daughters, we tried to help them, sometimes by writing letters of recommendation. At other times, we activated the old girls network, and Drucilla played a very important role in my daughter Laura now becoming the public defender in LA. She inspired her to study law. For 5 years, Drucilla and I had a subscription to the Metropolitan Opera. We started in the family circle, and as our waists got thicker and our knees felt weaker and we had more money to spend, we moved slowly down the opera to the more expensive parterre seats at the Met. The season of April before COVID hit in 2002, we watched the entire Ring cycle together and decided how much we hated Wagner's politics, but loved his music. After our matinees at the opera, we ate either at Fiorello's or Rosa Mexicana. Those of you who are New Yorkers know this. Drucilla had a magical relationship to food. I think Annie mentioned this. She never figured out how food was cooked and considered Sarita and myself, because we liked cooking, to be magicians. Not only did she know how to cook, she had also the taste of a Midwestern cowboy who would often order some grilled meat and pommes frites. Turkish food, to which I took her several times, drove her to despair, though she loved visiting Istanbul. She always asked me to make a selection of the metzes, that green stuff, she said, that green stuff. But she never finished what she ordered anyways, I always did. During the Trump years, Drew became one of Bernie Sanders' foot soldiers. She would get all dressed up in her dangling earrings and makeup and go and talk to the bros in Brooklyn, where the Bernie campaign sent her to converse with police officers who were curious to meet a lady law professor. And as has already been mentioned, Drew had a long love affair with Rosa Luxemburg. In fact, one of her last books, edited with Anne Gordon, is creolizing Rosa Luxemburg. In the fall of 2022, we were invited by the Goethe Institute of New York and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation to celebrate in honor of Rosa's, as she was called, 100th birthday. Alas, that conversation, planned for November 2022, would not take place. Drucilla's years of struggle against two lung conditions had weakened her heart, and after her hospitalization last summer, she was still very weak. In a memorable conversation about intellectual women in the public sphere, the ravages of aging, about whether we had the right to decide how and under what conditions we would appear in public, we decided that it was best to postpone this event to the winter of 2023. Well, it was not meant to be. I have lost one of my oldest and closest friends and intellectual companions. We have all lost a beautiful human being whose passion for life was only matched by the intensity of her commitment to make the world a better place, what in the Jewish tradition is called tikkun ha'olam, repairing the world and leaving it a better place than when you entered it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Bianchi. It's just really wonderful to be here with everyone today, especially in this particular space, which has such a long and storied history of activism here in the village. It's a very fitting venue for Drucilla's memorial. We are rightly hearing much about Drucilla as an intellectual giant today, and she surely was. As I reflect on her life's work, her thinking, as well as her tireless activism, not to mention her care for her loved ones and her zest for living, I marvel at how she somehow managed the seemingly impossible feat of synthesizing feminist theory with Kantian and Hegelian idealism, Marxism, Frankfurt School critical theory, Derridian deconstruction, Lacanian psychoanalysis, legal theory, decolonial thought, and analytic, moral, legal, and political philosophy, all the while maintaining a profoundly feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-capitalist revolutionary sensibility. Drucilla's thinking always steered an avid yet wise course among all these approaches, incorporating what was to her essential and rejecting what was not, and always arguing relentlessly for the conditions under which each of us might live more freely and fully in dimensions at once economic, political, juridical, psychical, sexual, and embodied. But as well as Drucilla's great intellect, I wanted to talk about her great heart. Among so many examples of her legendary generosity, I wanted to share one in particular. When I was a grad student at the New School in the early 90s, I read her first two books, Beyond Accommodation and Philosophy of the Limit, in Sally Ruddick's feminist philosophy course, and I was simply stunned by them, I think very similar to Roger's experience. To my mind, this was the urgent, synthetic, theoretical thinking we needed, as attuned to the complexities of deconstruction as to the exigencies of freedom struggles and the practical challenges of living a feminist life. When I found out she was a professor at Cardozo Law School right across the street on Fifth Avenue, I ran over there and asked if I could do an independent study through the consortium. Drucilla kindly agreed, and soon after that, I became her research assistant and helped her usher the imaginary domain toward publication. During this time, Drucilla was an amazing mentor. She generously plied me with delicious meals at Nadine's in the West Village, and, let me be clear, never once asked me to pick up her dry cleaning. Right? She had an incredible social circle of intellectuals and activists, and introduced me to many of them, including luminaries like Jacques Derrida, Niklas Luhmann, Anne Snitow, and Judith Butler. During this period, I found out I had advanced cervical dysplasia, requiring an urgent but routine in-office procedure called LEAP in New York. On my own as a young woman in a strange city on a strange continent, this was a scary prospect. But Drucilla took the situation in hand. I was blasé about it, but she came to appointments with me and interrogated the young doctor about how many of these procedures he had done. He assured us with a slightly wavering voice that he had done many, many. On the day, Drucilla accompanied me to the surgery. She sat next to me at Beth Israel Hospital while my legs were in the stirrups and the doctor dug about. It was only supposed to be a 15-minute procedure, but frighteningly, the blood suction machine stopped working and the doctor started panicking. Blood was flowing amply. It was kind of all over his coat. And he was on the verge of sending me down to the emergency room. The rest is all a bit of a haze, and I nearly lost consciousness a couple of times. But I remember Drucilla clearly ordering the doctor to stop using panic language and requisitioning smelling salts, which, by the way, are quite effective. After almost an hour of this, with Drucilla at the helm keeping everyone calm, the bleeding stopped, but I was in no fit state to go home. Drucilla took me back to her house and set me up on a guest bed in her office, where I spent the next 3 days resting and recovering and reading from her extensive library of philosophical works and mystery novels. I offer this story as just one example of Drucilla's steadfast advocacy and care. She was an unwavering support to me in a harsh and stressful profession. And in some ways, she was my second difficult mother on this, my chosen continent. She said she shared some of the struggles as my own mother in her love life, and shared also some of her tendencies to despair, despite her outward vivacity, her many career successes, and her wide network of extraordinarily interlocutors with whom she maintained passionate intellectual friendships. I remember running into her one day on the way back from the nail salon. She said, My mother taught me I cannot possibly meet a person like Toni Morrison for lunch without perfect nails. She maintained a lifelong friendship with Morrison, who told her before she died in 2019 that she must write a book called Thinking Like an Activist. Drucilla identified first and last as an activist, and that is exactly how she thought and lived. It is a great loss to us all that Drucilla never had the chance to write this book, but perhaps we can move forward with that legacy in mind, thinking and living like activists, if somewhat adrift without her steady guidance. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Michiel Bot. Thanks very much, Sarita, for inviting me to come here. I met Drucilla in 2010, and she just moved back from South Africa at the time and was looking for a research assistant. And the reason why she hired me was really quite simply that I was the first person to respond to her call that had ended up in a mailing list of the Comp Lit department at NYU on the other side of the square. For the next 3 years, I went to her apartment almost every Friday afternoon, sitting in her living room where the household's dogs, cats, and teenagers had right away. Drucilla, powered by copious amounts of Diet Coke, whose empty cans were accumulating on the table. And several of us will remember that it didn't always occur to her to throw the empty ones into recycling when taking a new one out of the fridge, would amazingly dictate all her work to me after spending the week reading, thinking, and taking notes. I soon learned to slow her down and ask her to rephrase if what she said was unclear to me. But with those minor interruptions, what ended up on the page was a coherent draft. The week after, I would read it back to her, and she would reformulate or add a few things, and the article or the chapter would be ready to send out. Drucilla always asked me to send it to Maureen McCrogan first, whose profound editorial imagination and wisdom she often already invoked during the writing process. Indeed, I sometimes find myself channeling Drucilla's Maureen when I'm writing myself. What's my point? Am I doing justice to the complexity of the issue? Are there more imaginative ways of describing or structuring this? Drucilla's way of writing through dictation, which was her way of negotiating the responsibilities of single parenting, which always came first because of her deep love for Sarita, with her work as a highly prolific critical theorist, made her articles and books particularly focused. Drucilla was not an essayistic writer who begins an article with an observation or question without knowing where she's going yet, allowing her readers to accompany her on their journey of exploration and association, letting them take their own turns and draw their own conclusions. Instead, Drucilla's texts are reports of the outcome of her journey of exploring and associating that had happened during the week. By the time the writing began, she had the argument ready. And this allowed her to focus on conveying the argument to her readers and on clarifying the intervention she intended to make, which was usually a very strong one. Indeed, the genre of her work remained close to the genres with which she began her life as a theorist, the genre of the position paper in revolutionary organizations, and the genre of the legal brief. In the dedication to her last book, Today's Struggles, Tomorrow's Revolutions, Afro-Caribbean Liberatory Thought, and I saw it was reprinted on the program, Drucilla wrote, "I've never thought of writing as a lonely or isolated activity. I've always thought with and through my comrades and friends." Although she dictated much of her work to research assistants, whom she treated as comrades and friends, she never asked me to pick up her dry cleaning either, and always asked me to share my work with her as well. Her writing is, and although the book is also dedicated to 5 specific comrades and friends, her writing is always also a conversation with comrades and friends in a broader sense. And she wrote about the work of other critical theorists she stood up for what she considered to be her comrades in an ongoing revolutionary practice by reclaiming, to paraphrase Walter Benjamin, the radicality of their writings and their politics against the conformism of interpretations that either relegated this radicality to a historical moment declared to be over, or ignored or disavowed it altogether. And as she wrote about law, she called her liberal friends back to the ideals of freedom and justice contained within the legal traditions. My first impression of Drucilla, after I managed to overcome the challenge of what I'll charitably call her broken intercom. Drucilla did not have a way with technology, as many of you know. And the challenge of the individuals barking at me in the hallway was one of amused wonder. Who is this strange, brilliant, and warm person? And this first impression has always stayed with me. I was sometimes reminded of it during our many long dinners at the struggling restaurants that Drucilla felt the need to support, and indeed, she couldn't care less about the quality of the food. When her loud Johnny Cash ringtone drew the attention of the other customers, and I smiled at what these other people might have seen her like. But of course, I also remember her political seriousness. While I would occasionally make fun of her for blaming every little annoyance on neoliberal capitalism without specifying how these annoyances could be remedied under socialism, her judgment of political realities was in fact often spot on, and her tactical and strategic imagination sharp. I'm incredibly thankful that Drucilla has become a very important part of my life, and I'm also very thankful to all her friends and comrades who have supported her in her difficult moments, in addition to sharing the joy of her very contagious laughter. Thank you.
So I begin, well, you know, on the way driving down, I was listening to Bach's Saint Matthew's Passion. And it's a funny thing, one of the things, every time I absolutely love Bach, and they're always the Bach haters. You know, there are people who, and I'm like, what you talking about? But as you listen to this thing, this is the kind of tempo and rhythm it was doing. And even though, as we know, Bach was in Europe, what I'm playing is something shared in Africa, in South Asia, all around. And I think about it because what a perfect way to come here and to have somebody so ancient. Because this is something that goes all the way back for thousands of years. To come to somebody whom when we meet always anew because she had reverence for the ancient, because she had so much love for those to come. I rarely wear a tie. But of course, if it were the other way around, you know, Drucilla would be with her lipstick, her makeup, or this, or that, and that, and that. And I thought in her honor, I should at least wear a tie. And my shoes are off, because many people know, it's an act to acknowledge ancestors. And ancestors make no sense without descendants. Drucilla would understand that our beloved Drucilla is now an ancestor, and she's an ancestor whom we all come and gather for, because she understood very well the importance of descendants. Many repeated that she absolutely, yes, Sarita, she absolutely loved you. And I could even add loves in the present tense. Like Roger, I met Drucilla through her work. And then I met her in person. But, she's one of those people, there's a saying I used to say, these days we got to teach the young, And I often say, people used to know how to make an entrance. And Drucilla was one of those types. I remember when I used to teach at Brown, there were times when a student come in late, I'd say, that's an improper entrance. I remember there was one student, she said, all right. She walked back, came in, strutted, and she twirled and sat on the seat. Proper entrance. Well, Drucilla was always a proper entrance. Whether it's her voice, whether it is what she's wearing, there's always a proper entrance. But I gotta tell you, in addition to this question of the entrance, right now, all across the world, there are people who will be talking about her work. And I've written about her work. In fact, it occurred to me, I looked at a lot of my writings, and people always say they love a person's work, but it's absent in the citations. Every single one of my books have a reference to Drucilla Cornell, even before I met her in person. You see? And this person, Drucilla, the thing about her I would like to talk about today is not the work in the formal sense, because we'll be acknowledging her in journals, in anthologies, all kinds of things. But there's another work, the work of the person. A phenomenology of Drucilla Cornell is rich. One of the things always struck me from the day I met her is her posture. She always stood up like this, even when you're shorter than her, because she was always acknowledging the dignity of the other. The other for her was grand, infinite, beautiful, valuable. Drucilla also, even when she was angry, always had slightly a smile. Because even when she was angry at you, it was an anger premised upon loving you. And so the fighting moment, because she was a fighter, was also a moment of joy, because for her, in conflict was growth. It was not a war to destroy the other. It was an opportunity to grow together. And this understanding of hers is something that carried through to other aspects of her life. We all know, as Roger said, the stories. And there are many, and there's a short time, so I can't recount them. But we also all know that it's weird when people use that language, supposed to, because the medical knowledge was we were supposed to lose her 30 years ago. Now, we got so used to not losing her that we were not prepared to lose her. In fact, we used to make some jokes, because as you know, they're the things that Drucilla really would not like to put into her body, like water. Vegetables. And in fact, I used to say, I used to say to Jane, I think Drucilla drinks so much white wine that she's pickled. You know, like this movie that Jane loves called, American Pickle, about a Jewish guy who fell into a pickle van and survived. And I was saying she's pickled from the inside out. But the thing is, throughout my life, I've had many friends. And in my childhood, because I started speaking very early, I had friends even when I was 3 years old who were in their 30s. And I remember one time my mother used to always say, my family called me Rick. Rick, why are your friends so old? And it was because they were so young. Because you see, there are certain people who have the gift of wonder. And from their early years through, it's not that they connect with their generation, it's they connect across generations. And that's why as they age, they're younger, because when they were young, they were older. And so meeting Drucilla was to meet one of those people who perpetually belong to humanity across the ages. And she took it a step further. I would say it's the life across the ages, because I gotta tell you, there's nothing like seeing those dogs in their tutus. And she had this way of making a lot of her environment. She would give so much that it created the shared produced reality that they began to look like her. And the buildings began to look like her, the community. And it makes absolute sense that if we think about her thought, it was always throughout the question of the accountability for a community premised on love and the affirmation of life. I got to tell you, because I've known so many over the years, I know when they're really going. And when I saw her after the first cardiac arrest, and we spent some time, I thought it would have been January, but I said, now I'm preparing myself. I said, she's going. And a lot of people, because of, as I said, the pickling, said, no. I said, she's going. And I realized as I began to say that to myself, it made it so clear how much I loved her. As that process began, the thing that was astounding was that her process was at every second an affirmation of life. It was not a fight for life. It was a living of life through the loving of others. Every phone call was about how others were doing. Every moment was about our children, our friends, ideas. And our very last long conversation was, interestingly enough, all about love. It was about different kinds of love. And you all have heard the story of what her grandmother did with the printing press on Hegel and love. But it was beyond Hegel as well, because as with her last book, it was about the communities of love globally, love of all kinds. And as we talked about that, the very spirit of what brought her to Ubuntu and brought her to the Caribbean was not what for many people would be a kind of epistemic or intellectual curiosity. It was because, as she did with Creolizing Rosa, is because she understood so clearly how we are all connected. And so as I thought about that whenever I saw her, it was not only the cacophony, right, with Drucilla making sounds, But there was always this sense that I began to realize that Drucilla has always been in our heart. And although there was a disease that affects a lot of mostly black women, and as we should understand, the openness of Drucilla made her everybody's kind of woman, black, brown, whatever. There was a friend who talked about her even as Jewish. I see the Magen David there. And she wasn't Jewish in that sense, but she was in the sense of the ethical openness, as Sheila brought out, of taking responsibility for tikkun olam, for repairing the world. And as she did it, as we know, her heart eventually stopped. And I remembered when Sarita said simply, she's gone. So much evacuated from my heart, my body, my soul. And that emptiness, that absence, is one of the paradoxes of what love and life are about. Because, and for me it was rough, it's because as we hold back and we stop, there's a question we all ask ourselves. If in infinite numbers of universes it would still end there, would it have been worth it to know this person? And the answer is resolutely yes. She has enriched our lives, and as she understood from Ubuntu, which says, I am because we are all here not only because she was, but because in our hearts she continues to be. So I thank all of you for this moment to reflect upon my beloved friend, comrade, as we would say, and also a person whose most treasured identity was the word mother, what it means to be responsible for those to come. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I also wanted to start by thanking you, Sarita, and everybody who worked with Sarita to gather us today. I know Louis had just mentioned that we have a friend who, it was a sign of how much he appreciated Drucilla that he called her Jewish. He said that every outstanding thinker, as far as he was concerned, was Jewish. But I say that actually because in many ways this gathering feels like a very Jewish way of celebrating a life, in the sense that we're speaking and we're laughing and we're weeping to bring her spirit back with us. And I thank you for doing that for us. So like Louis, I actually had been preparing for Drucilla's death for a while before it actually happened. And she and I co-edited a book called Creolizing Rosa Luxemburg. And when we were in the really difficult last stages of it, where we were really frustrating each other, frankly, I had this dream that she and I were leading a tour of a place that was a very strange fusion of Palestine and Berlin. And this was related to the insights of Rosa Luxemburg in some subconscious way. And we were barreling along. And I remember I was sitting in the front row, and I looked to Drucilla, who of course was in the middle with the mic, and she was on her sort of wobbly legs, but firm as she always was. And in that moment, it became clear to me that she was soon to pass. And I remember in the dream waking up feeling the immensity of her intellectual force, love force, life force, and how precious it was, and how lucky I and all of us had been to even touch it, and how gaping the hole was going to be in the coming months and in the coming years. I am in the sort of unanticipated but very profound position of having worked with Drucilla on what were her last 2 books. And of course, they were only her last 2 books because her physical body gave out. I fully anticipated that there would have been so many more, because there were so many more always in Drucilla. But the experiences of working with her on those were wonderful. And she felt very badly towards the end, because we had worked on this book that we were both very proud of, and yet she wasn't physically able to travel to promote it. But we would often call and sort of sit together and look at this book that we'd produced and wonder at its beauty, at sort of who it had brought together and the worlds that it imagined and spoke to and for, and who it centered. And it was a very profound source of pride and joy. I actually had met Drucilla 20 years before. Everybody who was close to me knew her but me. I knew her by name, but I had never met her in the flesh. And she came to speak about Between Women and Generations, the political theory workshop where I had just begun my doctoral studies. And I remember reading the book and being compelled and convinced by it, but more than that, being absolutely moved by the kind of political theory she was doing. I thought, oh, this is an endeavor I can join. This makes sense to me. But what was interesting was, as the formal host sort of peeled away, she and I ended up sitting for 2 to 3 hours maybe at the Black Dog Cafe, which is across the street from the law school at University of Pennsylvania. And Greg probably knows the details of the story far better than I do, because this is based on a conversation that happened 20 years ago when I was meeting Drucilla for the first time. But she told me a story that I found sort of mind-blowing, frankly, and informed a lot of the work that I've done since. So she'd explained to me quite how meaningful it was for her to be sitting facing Penn Law School in that moment, right? Because she had been hired with 2 other untenured women law professors at University of Pennsylvania Law School in a situation that was absolutely lacking support for what that decision represented. But what she told me about and really prided herself on was teaching the big required course, the introductory lecture course, where you could either cold call or call on people who'd raised their hands. And there were very few women in that course as students, many, many more men. And the men were perfectly ready to sort of sail through the course and impress her. And what she realized early on was that she needed to organize her students if they and she and this project of bringing women into law school were going to thrive. And so she sort of gleefully told me about these stories where she and these other 2 women would work with these women students and basically teach them what it was that was going to be taught in the class and coach them on the kinds of answers they should give, and they would practice them. And she was so delighted that when she cold called on them, they gave the perfect answers, and then they raised their hands enthusiastically. And then she, of course, got to tease the male students and say, you're having a hard time keeping up with your female students. And of course, this story ended quite sadly, and she never forgave Elizabeth Warren for her treatment of the other 2 untenured women. But I remember thinking for a long time about that story. Right? First, I think it goes to Greg's point, which is that part of the reason she was the intellectual that she was she knew that university spaces were not designed for people like her and the people she wanted to mentor. And so you couldn't expect them, without organizing, to actually support the kinds of efforts that mattered to her, that made being there worthwhile. And so what you had to do was to prepare for and organize yourselves for the moment of the classroom, or the moment of the faculty meeting, or the moment of fill in the blank, right? And I also remember just thinking as a graduate student then myself, how utterly transformative that must have been for those women students, to see what it was to work with other women to try to make that space one where they should be, and where they should be emulating precisely the kind of work that they were welcomed into. So that's sort of just the first thing that I'd wanted to mention. The second thing that always struck me about Drucilla, and this might be idiosyncratic on my behalf, is that I always thought of her as speaking, whether in a seminar, a formal setting, it didn't matter, in an informal conversation, as there was always a refrain. There was a particular point for that day or that conversation. And it was often an argument or an organization that she was particularly invested in, or a book that she had read and been moved by. And the conversation would sort of go in circles. There'd be verses, but we would return to the refrain with embellished meaning. It had been added to by all of the verses that came in between. But it struck me, again, as connected to her organizing, right? Because it was an incredibly open way of communicating with people who could understand whichever verse was actually relevant to them, and then join in the refrain, not as a slogan, but as one that they actually could understand. And the refrain that I heard over and over and over again, and never actually tired of, was when we were working on the Creolizing Rosa project. And we would often have long conversations, and she would call up, and almost as a non sequitur, sometimes this was the opening comment, sometimes it was 20 minutes in, Jane, Rosa was a revolutionary. And I sort of thought, okay, we know, right? But she would repeat, Jane, Rosa was a revolutionary, right? And I came to realize that Rosa was a revolutionary was a meditation, it was a challenge, it was a beacon, and centrally, the whole point was that it's not obvious what it means to be a revolutionary. And if it is obvious, we don't know that we have the wherewithal to do what it requires. We don't know if we can survive what will come if we actually do have the wherewithal to act as we should. And that this was, the whole point was that should guide our conversations, our decisions, from the trivial to the important. And as many people have already said, Drucilla was a revolutionary. And it's interesting to imagine what a revolutionary in 21st century neoliberal US is, right? And there are many things that could be said about this, but I only want to say a few, right? One is, of course, Drucilla's immense capacity to love. And what I find remarkable about her capacity to love was the radical openness that it required. That she loved to be surprised by what loving forced her to do and to learn to do, from technological things to many others, right? But for her, love was a commitment that required a willingness to transform oneself in ways that one wasn't always ready for. And I did absolutely love talking with her about mothering. It was one of my absolute favorite things to do. And she did always used to say to me, Jane, you have to keep me from collapsing into my Maoist tendencies. And I'll translate what that meant when she said it to me. What it meant when she said it to me was that she was so loving that she could often be too forgiving, that she could forgive things that maybe she shouldn't. I never let on to her that I had the same problem, but so I would sort of say, yeah, well I'll help you mind your Maoist tendencies. But the second piece of being a revolutionary that really strikes me about Drucilla, and that I particularly appreciate, and personally so, is that Drucilla knew that the left, and the progressive left, and the feminist left, could collapse into conservative bullying. And when and if it did, she would call it out and stand up for it, regardless of the costs. And in my own particular case, my father has been the subject of this kind of bullying. And there is tremendous pressure to scorn him, both in this country and the world. And Drucilla refused to. Many people have spoken about how loyal Drucilla is to her friends. She's also loyal to her own sense of judgment and her own understanding of the law. And she knew that publics often don't understand, actually, the nature of law, the difference between a charge and the difference of the findings, of et cetera. But it just struck me that when she didn't need to, and when there were real costs to her, she publicly stood up with my dad and many, many others. And that required breaking from people who are really important allies and comrades. And so it struck me that part of her willingness part of how she loves is she's willing for it to bring hurt, and scorn and hatred and all of those other things. That to love is also to take on all of those risks and costs. But I wanted to end on a lighter note, just with a series of just sort of short images that I'll forever associate with Drucilla and that make me laugh and smile. One, of course, is we've all talked about how Drucilla didn't like to eat very much. She liked to drink Diet Coke in the morning, white wine at night, salty, crunchy things in between. But wow, did she love churros. And I was so happy when she discovered, or maybe rediscovered, her love for churros in Connecticut. It was just the delight, and she never knew what it was called or didn't want to know what it was called. She'd say, Jane, what's that sweet thing I can dip in the chocolate? It was fantastic. I didn't grow up in a house, and I don't have a home where we have pets. But wow, did I love her relationship to her other than human creatures and all of their outfits and tutus. And I mean, wow, what a soft spot I have for all of her four-legged creatures. And they're just lovely. I also loved the way that she introduced her friends to each other at her holiday party. I remember Roger saying one time, she acts as if we all walk on water. But in her eyes, maybe we did. And maybe when we were with her, we did, for instance. But it was gorgeous. And I also loved how much she delighted in her students. I mean, one of our favorite things when we were writing a book was to publish work by people who were not known, who actually needed publications, who weren't affiliated with universities. And that was the best part. And she absolutely loved that. I also loved how she never tired of talking about the significance of being part of the Black Panther Self-Defense Force and what it meant as a white suburban girl to learn to shoot a gun if necessary. And I loved how when she was mocking academic things that should be mocked, that she called them fancy, fancy. But mainly a singular person who we're so blessed to spend some time with. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Friedman, and I loved Drucilla very much. And I must confess that the experience of being here and doing this has, for me, an air of unreality about it. I don't know what it means that Drucilla is gone, and to the extent I understand it, I don't believe it. So I'll restrict myself just to saying a few things about Drucilla that I do know to be true. I first met Drucilla in 2006 when she was giving a visiting lecture at the University of Cape Town on Kant's transcendental idealism. And I didn't have a clue what she was talking about. But a couple of things were clear to me. It was clear to me that I was in the presence of a historically important intellectual figure. It was clear to me that her message was urgent. And it was clear to me that something significant was about to happen in the South African constitutional order. South Africa represented for Drucilla the possibility that revolution was still alive in the world. And she uprooted her life here in New York City to move to South Africa and be part of it. Not just to think about it, not just to write about it, but actually to be in it. That was her approach to scholarship, and that was her approach to life. It's difficult to think of more impactful examples of scholarship and advocacy than the multiple contributions that South Africa made, that Drucilla made to the post-apartheid constitutional order and its legal academy. And I won't try to list those contributions now. The historical record makes those contributions plain for all to see. I can say a little something about my own relationship with Drucilla, which I think is a good example of how she was generally. She cared about young people. She was guided by them, and she was inspired by them as much as she guided and inspired them in return. She was always looking for young people who cared about the same stuff that she did, and when she found them, she nurtured them. And that's what she did with me. She not only taught me how to think properly about the things that mattered, and she not only taught me how to act on those things, but she also gave me opportunities to turn them into a life's work. She gave me a scholarship to work with her. She gave me a job as her research assistant. She gave me joint billing on some writing that we did together, which in truth was really written by her. I was, at very best, the Robin to her Batman, cape and all. And finally, she gave me a career by working the phone lines to help me land a job. There's a concept in African philosophy that really captivated Drucilla and formed the subject of much of her writing in South Africa. And the concept is Ubuntu Ngumuntu Babatu Baban, which, as Lewis mentioned, essentially means that you become a person through other people. And that was the philosophy through which Drucilla lived her life before she came to South Africa and long after she left South Africa. She saw it as fundamental to her own personhood, to her own personal development, that she should spend her time trying to uplift other people. And in turn, I am just one of many people who has become a person through Drucilla's engagement with us. That is Drucilla's legacy, and it lives on in all of us who she has left behind. Thank you.
Hello again. I want to thank the speakers for just being here and saying those kind words. It was really nice to hear different stories. Many of you knew her before I have, so it was nice to hear those things. We have about 20 more minutes or so if anyone wants to say a quick word, feel free to come up. Yes, please. Thank you, guys.
My name's Rick Bogart. I'm a friend of Drucilla's, a new friend. I had to come up and say something because I would feel bad if I didn't. I would feel bad. I didn't plan on it. I was leaving the house earlier this morning. My wife and Drucilla are like this. Drucilla and me were like this. We had many long conversations. I'm not going to go that way. There's been enough stories. She's very exciting, thrilling, inimitable, ubiquitous, and pristine. It doesn't end. What I like to do is I grab something out of the cabinet. I like to say something to Drucilla. I think I got it memorized. I didn't look at it yet. I didn't have time. But I like to say something to Drucilla. I've told her this before. Dear Drucilla, may the good Lord bless and keep you, whether near or far away. May you find that long-awaited golden day today. May your troubles all be small ones, and your fortune 10 times 10. May the good Lord bless and keep you till we meet again. May you walk with sunlight shining and a bluebird in every tree. May there be a silver lining back of every cloud you see. Fill your dreams with sweet tomorrows. Never mind what might have been. May the good Lord bless and keep you till we meet again. May the good Lord bless and keep you till we meet till we meet again. That's it.
Hello, my name is Greg. I was a student of Drucilla's at Rutgers University, and I became one of her assistants. So one of the most touching things about today is to listen to some of the other people whose names I've known for a very, very long time, but I've never actually had the pleasure of meeting. As you were speaking, I couldn't help but think that I felt all of the same things as you. Drucilla is someone who made me feel like it was okay to be enraged about all of the things that I was seeing as a young man in the world. She made it okay to stand up and fight, and she made it okay and virtuous even to invest in a love of knowledge and wisdom and growth and evolution. Many of the people in this room I met as a very young man. I had no idea what a privilege it was actually to meet many of you. I was just along for this ride that Drucilla was taking me on as her assistant. I love her very much. Serena and Ashley, I love you guys. And I just miss her a lot.
I'm back again. Thank you guys all again for being here. I strangely feel like I want to have a Diet Coke. I don't know why. Why? Maybe later. Anyway, thank you guys all again for coming. There's going to be a small reception at North Square. It's like across the park. I can give you guys more direction on that. I'll be at the door. If any of you would like to come, it's gonna just be some hors d'oeuvres and maybe some drinks and like nice memories, good talking and everything. So, all right. I think that's it. Thank you all.